In this episode, we sit down with Dr. Shaun Conway to talk about the future of measuring, verifying, and delivering social impact with new mechanisms and designs enabled by blockchains. In the conversation, Dr. Conway leads us through his history working as a medical doctor, then transitioning to health projects in his native South Africa, to working as a policy advisor for the UK government on development issues. The experience led him to conceive of an impact marketplace that could power better development outcomes on the ground. We cover the possibilities for better incentive design, governance structures, and real-life impact measurement through this protocol he is developing. This episode will be particularly insightful for those working in development, social impact, and impact investing.
And we'll just get right into it, Shaun. So thanks for joining us today. Can you start out by giving our audience a bit of an intro to you as a person, your background in tech and otherwise?
Yeah, really great to be here today. So I started my life as a physician, working initially in clinical medicine, and then got very involved in the HIV/AIDS response. So living in South Africa, we were facing this massive epidemic, and it was clear that we needed some systems responses to this. We needed to mobilize the profession, we needed to mobilize society. And so really kind of got deep into that, and that took me on a path into global health and then international development, working with the usual suspects: World Health Organization, World Bank, governments, and large corporations as well. And I guess through that path, well, I was always a computer geek. I had a ZX81 when I was a kid, and was learning to code. But medicine was my passion, and so software development was kind of just an interest. But I began to see the power of data and how that could really transform the decision making and also the effectiveness of what we did within a public health or development kind of context. And so a lot of the work I did was based on data systems, trying to improve how we collect data, use data for accountability, for instance, or for shaping the medicine's pricing markets and so on. And so that led me down this path to where I am now, I guess, which is as founder of IXO. It's been a journey since really we started working on this in 2015, and now have a level 1 blockchain, which operates as the impact hub, Cosmos blockchain, and all the protocols around that and the applications and so on, which I think we'll get into a little later on the call.
Cool. So it looks like if I play this back to you, the story is essentially you born in South Africa, grew up in South Africa. The HIV/AIDS crisis kind of was something that was happening at the time that you actually felt really values aligned. You wanted to do something about that, so you decided to enter the medical profession.
Well, I was in the medical profession before. So whilst at med school, it was in the context of the apartheid situation in South Africa, and there were large communities of people who didn't have healthcare living in the slums. And so there was a student health organization that I got involved in, and we did some of the very first work on mobilizing community members and training them up to be community health agents. So these are just people with no health background, very little education. And whilst doing that work, it was around the same time that it was starting to become evident that HIV was going to be a major issue. And I got involved in a project modeling out the life data from an insurance company, and using Excel spreadsheets and so on, and started drawing out the curves. And what we could see was a projection of this exponential epidemic. And I think everyone understands, what the epidemic dynamics are when you have an infectious disease that spreads through populations very quickly. And we've seen that with COVID. And so it was, okay, well, here's this massive problem that no one's talking about, no one's doing anything about it. So in my early days as a physician, I started to organize the medical profession, started the Southern African HIV Clinician Society, started publishing a journal, making treatment guidelines, etc. So really about coordinating and building up a systems response.
Very cool. So then early in your life, then you had exposure to kind of what we'll get into later, which is the power of community coordination, the human and coordination layer of actually addressing a also technical problem, right? There's it's a multifactorial issue. So then that took you from practicing medicine And then it looks like you then, like you said, moved into NGOs, impact organizations like WHO, UNICEF, and World Bank. Was this your involvement with the HIV/AIDS epidemic? Did you sort of look to impact organizations next as the place where maybe this is where we could do something about this? Is that how it worked?
Well, so I ended up doing a PhD at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine because I thought that was the path to kind of really go deep on how we could research and innovate within the systems responses. And I can talk a little bit about how that was very formative in...
Please do.
So I was fortunate at London School of Hygiene to have a heretical professor who taught us a course on human judgment and decision making. And basically he said, well, he was the heretic, but he said all these other people in the college are all heretics because they're frequentists. So they believe in,
Yes,
randomized controlled trials. Yeah, exactly. And so he introduced me to Bayesian statistics. And, remember, this was at a time before Google, before we had this sort of intuitive understanding what Bayesian statistics can do. Google knows what you want to find before you even touch the keyboard kind of thing. And so the idea was to use Bayesian statistics to predict the outcome of a decision. So I was looking into how do we create better decisioning systems that utilize, firstly, a social consensus mechanism to come up with the values, so the weightings and the ranking on those weightings of criteria that go into the decision system, and then use prediction science to say, okay, well, how likely are each of those values to be achieved? And then you come out with a decision that is no longer a black box decision, but it's a decision that has got rationality to it. And I felt this was really important because I'd seen the irrationality of how a lot of decisions were being made. I was part of the first consultation on global treatment guidelines for HIV, and it was a very controversial topic because the pharmaceutical industry had such power, having the patents on antiretroviral treatments. And I was in that, I was the rapporteur actually for the treatment guidelines. And what I heard in the meetings versus what actually got published as the final guidelines, there was a disconnect. And obviously there was a lot of lobbying and other stuff that happened in the corridors and closed rooms. And this didn't make sense to me, but how we could make such important public policy decisions in such a black box kind of way. And of course, Jack, my lecturer at the London School, was very much spoke about black box decision making and how this leads to failures because we don't know kind of what goes into those decisions and they become corrupt. And so this idea of being able to create accountability and bring transparency to decision processes, but also to use rational approaches that could bring in the wisdom of the crowds, could bring in human values and so on, was very exciting to me.
Very cool. So, and for everyone who listens to this, perhaps they're not familiar with the frequentist versus Bayesian ongoing centuries-long battle for how to frame probabilistic inference. But basically, maybe you could tell us just a quick little bit about this, because when I think about it, I think from everything you said, when I tried to make it crisp into a real life example, it could be something like using a crowd to estimate the potential efficacy of a social impact, not even venture, just an initiative, right? Like a public health initiative or something where instead of doing it top down, you also want to estimate the prior probabilities. So you get on the ground, you kind of say, hey, what do folks think will work? What is their actual service and system design that could make that more likely to work? Can we attach likelihoods to that and estimate the prior probabilities for a particular outcome and its impact? Is that roughly something like what you're thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. You've said it in quite a complicated way.
I am prone to do that, so definitely simplify it for our audience.
Yeah, so, when we're dealing with new information about the world, we don't know whether that information is true or we don't know whether something's going to happen again. So the sort of archetypal example of this is first cave person in the world gets up in the morning, goes out and sees the sun shining, and goes, that's really cool. The sun shines, and goes to sleep and wonders whether the sun, that same phenomenon is going to happen the next day. And it could happen or it could not happen. It has a 50% probability. But every morning going out there, the sun shines, and that probability of waking up and seeing the sun increases over time. And so what we have is a progression of probability based on priors. So starting with priors is really fundamentally important as a principle in this. It doesn't mean that probabilities are always going to be accurate because of black swan events. I think we've had that sort of realization that prediction systems need to be aware of things that are unexpected. But if there is an expected pattern, we'll be able to pick up that pattern, and we'll be able to then become more and more certain about that truth, or at least that probability. And so building on priors is very important. And that's essentially the Bayesian algorithm is actually a really simple, sweet algorithm. It just says, the probability given new information is based on prior probability plus the new information, and then we progress in a Markovian kind of way. Now, how we store that prior probability and then build on it is, theoretically quite straightforward. Just put down your probability today, record the probability tomorrow, or the new information tomorrow. But actually, in most of the data and information systems that we have in the past, getting a time sequenced and sequential building on priors record that can enable us to have trusted predictions has not been possible because of the way the data gets stored, and all the legacy problems of traditional data systems and governance around it and so on. And so the blockchain gives us a really powerful tool to do this. And so that's really where, the research kind of going back to the early 2000s, when I came across Bitcoin in around 2013, it was like, oh, wow, now I can see how this can actually work. Now we can build stateful systems that progress us through a sequence of probabilities that make us able to then utilize that state in order to influence what happens in the future. And that's like a hugely powerful paradigm.
Got it. So it sounds like you came out of a lot of maybe a decade or half a decade or so of working in medicine and working in impact altogether. And you had some good experiences and some decent outcomes. But then one of the major things, maybe if I were to rephrase some of the things you said, are key incentive misalignments and the inability to really update on information that's coming in so that you can really tweak any particular social impact initiative the right way, right? Whether that's inputting data from the community, inputting data from globally, all that kind of stuff. So before we get into state updates, statefulness, all that kind of stuff, what I found really intriguing in your journey was that you then kind of came up with this idea for IXO super early. Like, it seems like you were one of the earliest people to think about how to take a market-based and institutional economics approach to impact, at least in the blockchain space. And the stuff has been, people have been thinking about this for a while, but you really synthesized a lot of ideas in an interesting way. So could you tell us a little bit about the ideas behind collaborative aid marketplace?
Yeah, so the collaborative aid marketplace predated blockchain, or at least my discovery of blockchain. So it's 2008. I was working at the UK Department for International Development, and 2008, you may remember, was a remarkable year because of the financial crisis, but also in politics in the UK. So you had Tony Blair, who's one of his big tickets was Aid for Africa, and it was the time of Live Aid. So everything was about aid and how do we, as rich nations, support poor nations to meet the Millennium Development Goals. And then, of course, financial crisis. And Gordon Brown comes in and he says, all right, my Scottishness, we need to do more with the money, and we need to finance results. Now, I was sitting in a unique position because I was advising the UK government. So I was sort of at the top policy level, sort of at top down, making decisions about policies around financing and allocating capital and so on. And then I was also running an organization in Southern Africa, which was implementing programs on the ground. So these were everything from building health services, training health workers, to community development projects, providing microfinance, helping community members to create entrepreneurship opportunities and do local socioeconomic development. And of course, when crisis hit, suddenly the sources of funding started to dry up very quickly. And from the funders were saying increasingly, show us the results and then we'll fund you. So we need the data. And the implementers were saying, we need the capital to do the work. And so there was this disconnect in the supply chain of capital going from the funder, from the sort of top to the bottom, and a mismatch of the supply chain of data going from implementation up to the decision makers. And so this just seemed to me to be completely broken. And so I thought, okay, what about if we really localize decisions about funding and we create the participation and incentive mechanisms that local stakeholders can make decisions about how capital gets allocated using information that's available locally and having information feedback loops. So essentially, I provided this presentation. I was invited to speak about how Web 2.0 could transform the aid sector. So I presented at a conference in London, and those slides are on SlideShare from 2008. And so I thought of this as a collaborative aid marketplace. So, okay, how do we create a marketplace at a localized level where you have a collaboration between the funders, the implementers, the beneficiaries in local networks? And so to me, what we needed was some form of currency in that local network. And I call them eco credits. This is kind of pre-tokenization. We would call them eco tokens now, I guess. And so the participants in the decisions would utilize their credits to invest or bet on or curate projects. And if the project's successful based on the information that's been collected and verified, then there would be a payment and there would be an increase in the credits that you get. So your decision power was linked as what I called share stakeholder to the economic power of your eco credits. And so in my understanding at the time, this would build up a reputational system, but also create ways of collaboratively making decisions, but where those who make good decisions get more power in the system. And this is really sort of the genesis of things such as token curation markets, DAOs, and a lot of the other innovations that we've seen. So I actually went off and tried to build that just after 2008. And so I looked into local exchange currency systems or trading systems, local ledgers, and so on. The problem is that, if you're the one who controls the ledger, you have to get the buy-in of all the local stakeholders. It just wasn't going to work, really. Tried it out, didn't work. And so it was only in 2013, famously sort of lying on a hammock. I was taking a bit of a sabbatical, and I was in Sri Lanka and sort of surfing the web instead of surfing in the sea, and came across the famous white paper, Satoshi's white paper, and literally jumped out of the hammock and was like, Eureka, this is what's going to make it happen. And the key thing for me was this would give us the ability to bring performance information and financial information onto the same ledger. So that would solve this disconnect between the systems for collecting information and verifying what's actually going on and the systems for making payments. And so if you bring them into the same transaction system, that could really be transformational. So that was kind of where it started. And then it was, okay, where do we start implementing this? And we had an opportunity quite early on in 2015. I applied for a grant, and we were given the opportunity to test this out in a use case which linked preschool attendance in South Africa to a government subsidy scheme. So we were working with local government and a range of the stakeholders, service providers, and so on. We began to see really how powerful this would be. So for every attendance, government would pay, if the child attended on the day, the government would pay around $1 to the service provider. And the problem we were trying to address was just a complete lack of information about whether the subsidies were really going to the right organizations, whether there was truth in the fact that the children had attended, and just completely paper-based system, collection of accounting records at the end of every quarter, and so on. And so this really did show a huge impact, and that was the Ampli project, which then went on to be funded by UNICEF Innovation as well. We implemented that on Ripple, by the way.
I saw that, actually. That's funny, years later now, where Ripple ended up. Not that we're going to divert into Ripple, but I think you touched on a lot of really interesting themes there. So for us on the pod, we're particularly, why we gravitated toward this ownership economy concept is really just two things, really, right? It's that we think that if you have these evolving notions of ownership, and by extending ownership to a more broader base of folks, you will also improve decision making via stakeholder incentives and also upside. So there's more broader distribution of wealth from from that governance, right? And so it seems to me at least, that pretty early in your career, at least in Impact, you noticed that this co-design and co-ownership is a key piece, right? So After covering all of that up to now in collaborative aid and Amply and all that, why do you think this co-design and co-ownership is still not necessarily the most mainstream thing in impact? And I say this just because I have a lot of folks who do work, a lot of folks who do work in NGOs even today in 2022. Just last week, I was speaking with someone who does municipal projects here in Catalonia, in Barcelona, who's with the UN, right? So they're doing certain things in the more rural parts of Catalonia. And for her, just to repeat her experience, not that it's representative of the whole space, but it's really interesting in that she said, yeah, so for the last couple of years, her experience is in very much the self-managing organizations and all that, which is why she got this role. She was like, yeah, for the last couple of years, in Manresa, we've been working on municipal projects, and a lot of the people are coming in, program managers come in and say, oh, we need money for this, that, and the other. How should we do it? And I always start by saying, how do you think we should do it? And I give them a few design principles, right? And she was like, their minds are blown at this new approach, right? So this is a long-winded question, but I'll bring it back around for you, right? Basically, you're 14 years on from where you put this idea together for collaborative aid marketplace, and you had a whole bunch of experience with the power of co-ownership and co-design. Why do you think that's still somewhat underexplored more broadly and impacted NGOs?
Yeah, so I would say I'm going to put myself in a bit of a controversial position here, but well, the first is agency, which is not controversial. Okay, so where do we place our agency in these systems? And pretty much if you talk about development agencies, there are agencies, and whether it's at a local level, who gets to decide about local service delivery, collection of your garbage, how water supply works, or whatever. We tend to transfer the responsibility for decision making to public agencies, for instance. And so in terms of where the locus of control and the locus of decision making lies, it mostly tends to be abstracted away to these agencies. We see alternatives to that, better forms of local governance, like in Switzerland, where have had experience of that, where seemingly trivial decisions at a local cantonal or local community level get put to the community, and the community decides on things like which day of the week should our garbage be collected. And so people are practice agency and are given agency, and they have a system that enables agency to be executed. So that's the one side of it, is just really re-looking at this model of agency. Who do we give our power away to, and then what are the systems that then entrench that or make it difficult to not have individual or community or local agency. The second is corruption, and that's the more controversial one. And I think there's been a huge amount written about corruption in the system, and it's not only financial corruption. Corruption is essentially about power. Who gets to decide and who gets to benefit from those decisions? And so, I could say corruption would be everything from the husband of a capital allocator saying to his wife, who's the person responsible for making those allocations, I'd like to see this kind of project implemented, and somehow that decision kind of flows through. And so the agendas, the prioritization, and so on that happens within agencies is not informed by how it should be informed or how it's claimed to be informed. There's always biases and corrupt decision-making processes. And that actually goes back to my earlier point about having decisioning mechanisms and systems that enable us to make better decisions where actually the inputs to the system are very clear, and you can question whether we've got those inputs right. So particularly there's two sides to it. The one is values and the weighting of those values. So if we say, the decision that came out of the system doesn't seem right, we can go back and say, well, let's look at those values, and did we get our values right, and did we get our weighting of those values right? Or you can say, well, it seems that there's an error in the system because our values and weightings are right. We validate those. Yep, those all seem fine, but still it seems to come out with a decision that doesn't make sense. Well, then we need to go and look at our predictions and say, well, maybe somewhere we've kind of got the numbers wrong in terms of the probability of those values being achieved by the decision. So better decision-making tools, and then the incentives to use those tools, and the ability to root out corruption. So tools that can be used at a decentralized level by local people so that we don't give away our agency, incentives to use the tools, and then transparency and accountability around how these systems are run. And when we talk about ownership, I remember saying to my son many times, you need to own it. You did it, you need to own it. So ownership is not only about financial ownership, it's also about accountability and owning the results of our decisions. And that's particularly important these days.
Yeah, I just had one question on, you're talking a lot about the buy side of the market, right? So the experience you had with DFID, where you were now, I think it's called FCDO within the UK's government, or similar experiences within USAID, where I've had some prior work and current work. There's issues on the buy side of the market about who's actually doing the funding and the challenges around designing the mechanisms to actually fund the right providers on the ground. But isn't there a supply side issue here as well in terms of capacity building? I mean, I just read through, just in reading your white paper, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, a lot of these local providers simply do not have the capacity to engage with a DFID or with a USAID or with a World Bank, and need a lot of support in terms of getting up to a level where they're able to take on a significant grant or a significant investment. Did you find that to be the case in your work in health and subsequently in your work in the development space within kind of a state institution?
Yeah, so there's multiple levels to that. So one is just about capacity, and capabilities of the service providers. So in the health sector, huge shortages of healthcare workers. And so a lot of the work we did was around how do we leverage technologies such as mobile health, mHealth applications that can bring decision support tools, data collection tools, and so on to agents who can perform service delivery, but aren't necessarily trained as, formally trained as health workers, as nurses, doctors, and so on. And so part of it is about using technologies to enable a task shifting and to provide kind of technology-enabled delivery mechanisms that enable things to scale and to be done with greater quality, I guess, sort of built into the system. But then at a higher level, in terms of organizing those programs and those workers and mobilizing the cash, the real difficulty that I've experienced over and over again is that you have to bid on these funds. And the amount of work that goes into the bidding process, writing proposals, competing for funds, and it's an industry, to write proposals, and it's hugely time consuming and costly. And so that whole marketplace, if we think of it as a marketplace mechanism, is kind of broken, and it's also corrupt. So the organizations that are really good at writing proposals are the ones that tend to get funded. There's also a whole industry around that of service providers who help to write grants, who help to position funding requests, and so on. And so the entrenched organizations tend to be the ones that they get funded, and there's a lot of corruption in that process as well. If we look at USAID funding, where does it go? How much of it actually ends up in the beneficiary country versus back in the organizations in the US that are contracted to deliver these services? So this is an age-old problem. And so with decentralization and alpha bonds, for instance, we've got the ability to create smaller scale, localized funding mechanisms with greater plurality of who gets to participate as funders, as implementers, and as verification service providers. So an example of what we're working on in this is our alpha bond.
Before you go into that, because I want to break down alpha bonds in a series of steps and actually get into what IXO is doing. So just to cue up what the problem statement is today, because people who don't know the development space, this is probably all kind of new. So effectively what you have is you have these government institutions or quasi-government agencies like DFID or FCDO within the UK. And then in the United States, you've got USAID, which is a portion of the State Department. There's funding allocated by the government to these organizations, but they often are not the ones that actually contract with service providers on the ground. They contract what are known as through prime contractors. And today, if you look at, it might be able to, the numbers are fairly similar in the UK, but if you look at the US, today about 6% of those dollars go to local service providers on the ground of all of the money that's given. And so the US administrator today, Samantha Power, has said, we want to get that up to 25% over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. And so when you're talking about kind of this, whether it's corruption or incompetence or just the bureaucratic process. I mean, having gone through a couple of these bids, it's a nightmare. If you're a startup, you need to have audited financials to be able to subcontract. A second challenge is that there's no real mechanism to directly engage with these funds, right? Because the process in and of itself, we're talking about 100 million or $1 billion grants. The process itself is done in a way where the prime contractors will go out and build teams of service providers in advance and ask them to be part of their bid. And so if I'm a service provider working on health issues and I've got a couple $1 million budget in Cape Town, and I'm trying to figure out, how to deliver on health outcomes, it's not like I can actually go and engage with the US government or with USAID or FCDO or with the Dutch government or with the multilateral organizations like the World Bank. I have to actually go through one of these primes, and I really need to be invited into a bid. And so the business development process is always a bit reactive to what the primes need. So then you've got this kind of construct of, okay, how do we get more local enablement or local empowerment and more dollars flowing in? And this is where the idea for IXO came from. So can you just kind of walk us through the protocol in a bit of detail today?
Yeah, so what the protocol is about is being able to make claims about outputs and outcomes. So what's going on in the real world. So claims around, a child is immunized or within any sector, so you have these claims and you need to have a mechanism then of verifying the claims and using the data and the verification of the claims, the proofs, and link that to financing. Now, through the protocol, you can produce digital assets. Let's call them NFTs, because I think most people are kind of familiar with NFTs. It's a bit more nuanced than that. You have classes of non-fungible tokens that represent these outcome states. So what most people will probably be familiar with is the tokenization of carbon credits. That's one that's easy to kind of understand. Behind the carbon credit, there's a certificate, a carbon emission reduction certificate, for instance, and that sits on a registry. And so that can be bridged across into becoming a digital asset. So now we've got carbon tokens and we get derivatives of those and start trading them and putting them into DeFi mechanisms. So the protocol that we've developed uses new data standards and identifier standards that are now becoming standards at the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. So it's not just a conceptual thing, it's a very operational thing about what do these data models look like, how do they get verified, and how do they embed the identifiers of who's making the claims, who's verifying the claims, and what's the claim about. And then that verified data becomes part of the data asset that backs up the impact token, or whatever you want to call it, the carbon credit, the immunization certificate, and so on. Now, there's two kind of financial aspects to this. Once you've got good data and you can build financial systems and economies on stateful verified data, how does that get financed? And so alpha bonds are the way of bringing capital in order to finance the production of outcomes in this way. So this is based on a concept that started around 2010 about results-based finance. So essentially, results-based finance says these development financiers, whether they're impact investors or the development agencies that you mentioned earlier, or any of a growing range of organizations, capital allocators, businesses, etc., that are going to put money into outcome states being achieved, that is done in a way that the payment is made for the results. And so essentially there's a contract for a future state to be achieved, and then risk investors come in and they provide the working capital that enables the services to be delivered or the infrastructure to be built or whatever needs to be done in order for that future state to be achieved. Now, that's all very well, and it's the way we've seen that play out over the last decade and a bit has been in things such as impact bonds, green bonds, and so on. So these are debt instruments that are issued. They get risk investors to come in, put in capital, and then when the bond reaches its maturity, if the promised outcome has been achieved, then the investors get paid back, and there's usually a coupon value on that. So the investors take the risk, and the buyer, which may be government, maybe or any of those other categories of funders that I mentioned, would then be paying a premium because they're not taking the risk, and that's a way of mobilizing private capital, risk capital into development processes. And there are various sort of combinations of this in terms of blended finance and so on, like who gets to actually be the risk investor, who gets to be the outcome payer and so on. Problem with these systems is that the way they're implemented, if we take an impact bond as an example, is they're incredibly expensive, because the way that you set this up with a set of adversaries, essentially, the outcome payer doesn't want to pay for the results unless the results were delivered. The risk investor doesn't want to invest unless they know that the outcome payer is going to pay. The service provider wants to know that they're going to get paid the money to deliver, and they have to make claims about what they've done. So essentially, you've got a perfect game theoretic setup of adversaries. Now, when you try to implement that in the traditional finance kind of context, that means lots of lawyers' fees to set up all these contracts between the parties. Lots of intermediaries have to come in and make sure that everyone's doing what they say that they would do. And a very slow process to convince the risk investors to come in, because you have to have pre-commitment of the portfolio of investors. You need to know that everyone's in to fund this thing. So it takes a while to form that capital, get everyone to agree on what's the risk premium for funding things that are very hard to know what is the risk premium, because most of these things, they're development projects in complex world environments. You don't know if it's going to pay out or not. And then convincing the outcome payer to pay, and then commissioning the service providers. So all of this is hugely expensive. And generally what the evidence shows is that development impact bonds cost about 40% of the capital just to run the instrument. So we've been working with one of the leading development impact bond issuers, which is UBS Optimus Foundation, is part of UBS Bank. And they have the largest development impact bond for education in India. It's financing education for 300,000 primary school kids across 3 states. And so I've gone deeply into this. I've done lots of visits into India, really sort of looked at what's working and what's not working. But we've been on a research and development program, which started in 2017 with UBS, to then look at, okay, how do we use digital finance and Web3 and the IXO protocol to completely change that in terms of how to make it easier to issue bonds, quicker to form capital, more efficient to use the capital in terms of pricing the risk, and then automating the agreements between the different participants so that we can cut out a lot of the sort of intermediaries and the legal service providers, and also bring the agency down to the local level. And so in our impact bond pilot, our alpha bond pilot in India, we have Chimple, which is a local NGO that is an educational technology provider, who've distributed tablet devices to 500 households. Embedded in the devices is software that links the devices to our blockchain and feeds through claims that are made by the devices. So each time the child is interacting with the program on the device, the little educational program, it's capturing data about the usage, the level of the program, the tests that they've passed, etc. So we get a lot of granular real-time data on usage and on progress through the program. And then the funding is done at within an alpha bond, so it's a small scale. It's a $60,000 investment to these 500 tablets over a 1-year period. And then we have a signal coming through based on the data that's being generated off these devices that transforms into an alpha signal. So an alpha signal is a value between 0 and 1. It's basically saying, like, what's the probability of the payout happening? So we have a defined success criteria, so many children having passed the level of literacy and numeracy that's required. And there's an external verification service that has done baseline testings on all the kids. It's like an SAT score for like 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. And then they'll come in at the end of the 12 months and do the end line assessment. And then the delta between baseline and end line will need to pass a threshold for the outcome payment to be made. And what the alpha signal is doing is, on a real-time basis, as that alpha signal comes in, it's adjusting the pricing on the bond. And so we get dynamic pricing of capital. So you don't need to form all the capital up front, and you don't need to pretend that you have knowledge of what the risk of this intervention is. But those that have a higher risk appetite, who are going to come in early, pretty much, like any startup funding, you have angels, and then you have your initial investors, then seed investors, right, Series A, Series B, etc. And the pricing changes over time, except this is a continuous process, and it factors in the risk at different points along that funding path.
Okay, so there's a lot in there, and I think we need to break this down a little bit. So effectively, what happened about a decade ago is we moved into this environment where there was the emergence of impact bonds. And impact bonds is essentially, as part of the funding mechanism, the funder would be paying for outcomes, right? And so there might be a premium payment if certain outcomes are achieved, or you can imagine a stepwise function. If we get to this level of educational attainment for this population, you get X more. If you get to this level, you get Y more. So there are all sorts of ways of structuring this information. The challenge is twofold, right? One is in actually structuring the development bond, and there's multiple challenges here, right? Because it's unclear what interventions are going to lead to the right outcomes. In a lot of the development space, we still don't know that. We have good ideas, but a lot of quantitative work has not been done to actually identify what are the best interventions to lead to the best outcomes on the ground based on a particular portfolio, whether it's agriculture or health or climate change resiliency or education, et cetera. The second challenge is that you don't have an oracle. And when we talk about an oracle, what we mean is a third-party stream of data that's coming in to influence the price, or to influence kind of how we think about whether or not this particular project is going to achieve this particular outcome. And so what alpha bonds have done is they're using kind of this real-time oracle. And in the example that you give, they're getting real-time data on whether or not certain educational attainment has been achieved. And they're feeding that into the actual pricing mechanism for the bond itself, so that if you have enough liquidity within the marketplace, you could actually trade up or down the risk premium on that bond based on real-time analysis of a development outcome being achieved. And so what you're pulling together in the marketplace is several things. You're pulling together a taxonomy that helps to better understand the best interventions for outcomes potentially, or at least categorize these into particular buckets where people can make investment decisions, say, I want to be exposed to that asset class. You're pulling in the ability for an oracle or a series of oracles to influence the real-time calculation of assets that are traded within that marketplace. And then you're creating the liquidity mechanisms or building bridges to liquidity mechanisms to effectively ensure that there's enough funding coming in to enable these local providers. Is that an accurate kind of recap of the marketplace?
Yeah, that's very eloquently summarized.
Yeah, I think we're done. No.
So the other exciting part of this, not to miss out on this, because I think this is really where the future lies, and I've been talking about this for a number of years now, is then what is represented as those, or how those outcomes are represented, and how we create markets around those outcomes. So we spoke about the role of the outcome buyer. Now, the outcome buyer it can be an end consumer, it can be a development finance institution, it can be a business that's buying the products, B2B. So there's lots of different configurations of who the outcome buyer is. Let's use carbon credits as an example of what they're buying. You can just imagine, there's a very diverse marketplace for who's going to buy carbon credits for different purposes. And so the important space that I think we're seeing evolving and developing, and I'm happy to see this based on kind of what I was preaching about since 2017, is a marketplace for tokenized outcomes. And so we're seeing that with carbon credits, and I believe we're going to increasingly see it for all kinds of other outcome states around which there are taxonomies, and the taxonomies link directly to the measurement frameworks that we have. So we're not inventing new things, but we have the Sustainable Development Goals. Within those goals, we have a bunch of measures, and those measures provide the taxonomy for how you measure, for instance, a girl's education or a health outcome or whatever. And so by embedding those into the data structures that I spoke about earlier, and tokenizing those, as we call them, impact tokens, you can call them earth tokens, whatever you like, you can just brand them how you like, tokenized carbon credits, tokenized education credits. We now have got assets that can be put into decentralized finance mechanisms, whether that's as collateral or creating derivative fungible tokens off of them, as we're seeing what's happening with carbon, with Toucan Protocol and Regen Network and so on, or they can be put into financing arrangements. So linking the tokens, the impact tokens to the alpha bonds is a really interesting construct. So for instance, if the alpha bond is to fund a carbon capture project, the outcome payment may be the carbon tokens that are generated, or they may be the capital proceeds from the sale of those carbon tokens. So there's really interesting ways of configuring this, including, those tokens can represent IP, data, etc. So there's a really rich marketplace. And I think we're seeing already examples of this, like Ocean Protocol with their data tokens. I have an idea around, or a mechanism around tokenizing and valuing and trading on data. VitaDAO does the same with IP for patents in the pharmaceutical industry. And we're going to see more and more of this.
Very cool. I think, too, like one of the things that really caught my attention with the Chimple example and what Martin was saying about impact oracles is, we do need, to some extent, we do need a third party to verify that some things have happened, right? And then in addition to that, blockchains, which you mentioned all throughout, really have this ability to maintain state, update on state. So that sort of Bayesian updating that we mentioned earlier in the show is essentially what they're doing with the alpha calculation, right? Some events happened. Does that make it more likely for this education intervention to meet its goals? So one of the interesting things on the show that we've talked about with a few folks, and it's been in our show notes, is this text, Seeing Like a State from James C. Scott, which has been kind of informative for me, very much so, in terms of how ownership, governance, and other things like that have fed into planning failures in the 20th century. So I see a lot of, there's been a lot of blockchain folks who have read it and those who haven't, but it's really the point that I'm trying to drive at here is like blockchains can make lots of data streams legible. They can make the complexity of certain topologies, legible to us, for once, to human technocratic actors. So when we look at things like, these interventions, like not just Chimple, there are all types of things like this happening, as you mentioned. There's, Toucan and the VCM, the voluntary carbon marketplace, all that kind of stuff. What is your opinion on, now that we have all these new complex data streams coming together, what can we actually do with blockchains that is going to be different than the planning failures that happened in the last century, right? What can we do to kind of ensure we make new mistakes that are also not necessarily going to replicate this technocratic top-down thing where essentially, I don't want to look at this a century later and go, yes, what blockchains did was give technocrats more data to act on, and then they kind of made the same outcomes, right? So what do you think is our horizon for new things in this space?
Yeah, so I think firstly, the governance mechanisms, but not just governance around funding allocation, but actually taking it a step back and saying, okay, what are the criteria and what are the values? And so what I was referring to earlier in decisioning systems, getting social consensus around the criteria and values and the weighting of those values. And I think this is really a big missing piece currently on all of the DAO decisioning machinery that we have, that we just kind of jump directly to the funding decision, but we don't have enough policies and artifacts around, okay, well, what is it that we value and what are those values and how do we put them into the decision process? And so we're seeing a kind of gap currently between the financial aspect and the human values and not bringing those human values on the chain. But actually getting that right is in principle really straightforward. Kind of what, as I said, what I've been thinking about and working on since a long time ago. And now, because we've got ways of putting those policies essentially into the mechanics of the chain, I think we will see some innovations around this and some things that we're working on as well. So how do groups, and those groups can be heterogeneous, they can be configured in different ways, but how does a group make a policy? And that policy then leads to an authorization mechanism on chain. And with Cosmos, we've got some really interesting SDK developments that are going to really enable this with the group module, the auth module, etc. So you can have a group making a policy that provides a scope of authorizations implemented by the auth module, which determines things like, who can get paid and what are the criteria for being paid. but where the criteria have been defined, as well as kind of the business logic around this. So I think that's one thing that I'm hoping we will see much greater sophistication around. And then the second is just on this measurement of state and putting state into mechanisms where we can incentivize the achievement of future state outcomes. So because we've got this sequential record and we can put in place payment triggers and so on, whether it's an outcome payment or like an escrow type of thing, we can say if this happens in future, then there will be some kind of payout. And so we can create incentives around which and data points around which to coordinate our activities. And then we just need to make sure that the proofs that are that are making the triggers happen are trustworthy and verified and so on. And so we've got all of these building blocks in place. And it's really now about, okay, how do we operationalize this? And maybe just sort of very future thinking, I was inspired by Trent McConaughey's Medium post back in 2018 about Nature 2.0. And he spoke about AI DAOs, so where you actually have AI as a participant in the DAO using the pre-programmed, predictive power and decisioning capabilities of an AI as part of the decision-making process. It doesn't necessarily only need to be AI, but it can be a mixture of AI and so oracles and humans participating. And so the idea there is that nature can enhance its ability with technologies to purchase services, for instance. So imagine a forest actually, having data feeds and so on that will trigger payments or requests for work to be done, to come and protect the forest and then make payouts to the service providers that do that. So that's kind of the direction of travel. And I think it's super important to get that right. And this sort of takes us to the whole sort of, I think, next step around what data layer are we creating here. So we've got a stateful verified data layer, and we put that on top of, let's say, like nature. We're bringing more information into nature. So one of the projects we're working on is with a group that's doing a huge conservation effort in Namibia. So they're creating the largest conservation area on the planet. It's called the Orange River Karoo Conservation Area, ORCA. And so they're buying up farmland and consolidating it all into this massive reserve area. But the question that these conservationists have is, okay, how do we finance this? What's the sort of economy we can create on this? And so we're going through a design process of looking at how we build a data layer and solidify data linked to the land, and then enable an economy to be built on that data. And so, if we think about how anything in the world gains value, it's by solidifying information. So you can take a raw material, bring some know-how into what to do with the raw material, and transform it into something else. Essentially, what you've done is you've solidified data or information into the product, and the product becomes more valuable. So how do we do that with NFTs and verify data and overlay that onto assets such as conservation land, and then build an economy on top of that? That's starting to get into a whole other thing, which we could have another hour's conversation on, I think.
Definitely. I think if I were to synthesize a bit of that too, it's not necessarily that we have any kind of utopian view that we'll be able to break down every complex data stream and input to an ecology. It's more that, what do we need to provide agency to the actors? What do we need to know that certain outcomes have actually been achieved? And then how do we build a system with economic throughput that actually we don't necessarily need to know every single little thing that happens, right? Like if we cover those, we might, and governance, we're in a better place.
Yeah, so I've been hugely inspired by the work of the Connection Science department at MIT at the Media Lab. And the empirical research they've done is around information flows and how to use information flows together with financial flows to influence what people do and how social change happens. One of the sort of insights that they've gained through this is that you don't need to know the information. You just need to know the metadata of the information. So you need to see what's flowing, how the information is flowing. And I think that goes back to my earlier example of our very first experiments with Project Ampli, collecting data about children attending preschool. We didn't need to know the child's name or a lot of information, but just having counting whether something happened on a day at a place already gave us huge amounts of information about a bunch of things, attendance. And you could even use that to predict, sort of do early prediction of epidemics, because suddenly the attendance at preschool falls off and you can pick that up. And so it's actually really, really quite minimalist data points, but just by counting better without needing to get into like too much information, we can already improve our systems.
Very cool, Shaun. Well, I think that coming into this, I was already kind of on board, but I'm even more excited for where IXO is headed. Basically, from my perspective, this idea of bringing Bayesian probabilistic inference as a mechanism to update on the likelihood of things is fascinating. It's a thing I've been looking at for at least 12 years, and it's super cool to see that that's an implementation that you're actively driving in the real world today, coupled with this updating of state that you get from your protocol is going to be something I've said before, maybe on the show, but in my role in product in the past, I've always told my PMs and other folks that I speak to that you just have to make new mistakes, right? That's really your only prerogative here. I just want to see you making new mistakes given the vision of what we're doing, right? So at the very least, I'm excited for learning from what you folks are doing. So super cool. The last bit then, we always give folks a few seconds to shill and tell everyone where to find you online, where to stay up to date on the project. So please, over to you.
Yeah, so we're at IXO.world, and on Twitter it's at IXOWorld, IXOWORLD. I'd really invite people to join our intelligence platform as well, which is Earth State. And what we're doing there is collecting information about what's moving in the state of ReFi and the tokenized Earth economy, and of course also observations about news and updates on the state of the world relevant to the kinds of projects that are implementing these technologies to change that state. So that's earthstate.ixo.world. And then very shortly, we will be going live with our Launchpad, which is kind of a dog fooding, or it's a meta. So we've built a platform for organizations to establish marketplaces, we call them decentralized impact marketplaces, which each have an embedded decentralized exchange, a DEX, for trading impact assets that they curate for their marketplace, connect investors to project implementers, to Oracle services, and so on. And so we're launching a bunch of marketplaces together with partners across the world, some really exciting projects, from social sector in Hong Kong to some of the projects I've mentioned today, along and full pipeline of projects coming through the Launchpad. And so that'll be going live very soon, and that'll be at launchpad.ixo.world. And that'll provide an opportunity for you to also get involved in testing out the alpha bond mechanism, because we're going to be implementing that as a governance mechanism. So you can actually stake in an alpha bond to show your support for a project. And if the project achieves a sufficient staking into the alpha bond, that will pay out an outcome payment of IXO tokens. So it's kind of farming rewards for curating and making decisions about these marketplace candidates. And we'll be using the same mechanics to curate alpha bonds for projects that are producing carbon tokens and things in the future. So there's a lot happening and a lot on our roadmap. But it's a journey. It's a journey. We've been gone on this journey for a while, and these successes don't just happen overnight. But we're seeing such huge change happening right now. We're at the tipping point.
Fantastic. I'm also an IXO holder. I think I got an airdrop a while ago, not much, like 600 or so. So I'm definitely looking forward to using them, especially with this decentralized impact marketplace. Can't wait. That's awesome. Cool. Thanks a lot for your time, Shaun, and very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and really great conversation.